It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us from New York City, Noor Ibrahim, international news editor of The Daily Beast. How are things in Gotham?
Very good, thank you. How are things in Paris?
Things in Paris are rainy, but we'll get to that, I suppose, in a moment with Vivian Walt, Paris correspondent for Time magazine. How have you been?
Not too bad.
Not too bad. How's Vladislav Davidson, the author of Odessa, from Odessa with Love, journalist, and at the Atlantic Council? How are things?
Great. Getting ready for the Cannes Film Festival.
Getting ready for the Cannes Film Festival. From Brussels, Dave Clark, news editor at the French news agency AFP. Dave, Tuesday you were in Kyiv, the day 32-year-old video journalist Arman Soldin was killed in Ukraine by Russian rocket fire near the front lines in the east. He seemed like just, a great guy as well as a dedicated journalist. From everyone here and to all your colleagues around the globe at AFP, we want to really offer our deepest condolences at this moment.
Thank you very much, Francois. We will all miss him greatly. I'll miss him. We spent the first 4 or 5 weeks of the war together in Kyiv, and I was due to join him again next month in Ukraine to head to the front line, where he's been more or less working since September, flat out. It's one of the most terrible moments in my long career in foreign correspondentry, and it's gonna mark the coverage of this war for us, I think.
AFP, whose video team does a fantastic job covering the war in Ukraine, and we'll be talking more about it coming up. First, though, let's begin with Turkey. A final rally for a nail-biting finish in Istanbul, back where he started out as mayor, Turkey's leader of 2 decades, trailing in the polls, but within the margin of error. Recep Tayep Erdogan facing high inflation, anger surrounding February's devastating earthquakes, and an opposition that's, well, coalesced. Kemal Kilicdaroglu, boosted by the 11th-hour withdrawal. Here you see him in Ankara on this final Friday of campaigning. The 11th-hour withdrawal of 2018 runner-up Muharrem Ince, who was running this time as a third-party candidate. He'd seen his support fade to naught, and Thursday threw in the towel.
I'm withdrawing my name from the presidential candidacy. I'm withdrawing from the race. I'm doing this for my country. I tried to provide a new channel for the voters, but I failed. If the opposition loses the election, they will blame us. Let's not give them any excuses.
And of course, this has everyone taking their calculators. I didn't formally endorse the opposition leader, but it seems like it's mathematical. Vladislav Davidson, what with the latest polls, I don't know how reliable polls are. There's so many variables, but still, saying that these are votes that possibly, probably could go to Kemal Kilicdaroglu.
It looked like Erdogan was just gonna get through again, not with a more difficult election this time than the previous few times, but now it's really looking like this could be the one time that things could really go in the direction of the opposition. I always think that he's one of these strong men who's in there forever for 20, 30, 40 years, but it really looks like the cards are really breaking against him on this one.
They're breaking against him for now. We'll see if it's one round or two. Now, compounding Ince's woes were rumors of a sex tape, and a day after Russia's foreign minister wished Turkey good luck and an election free of, quote, any external influence, Kemal Kilicdaroglu pointing the finger squarely at Moscow, the CHP leader, never directly referring to Ince, but stating in a tweet that was in both Turkish and Russian, Dear Russian friends, you're behind the montages, conspiracies, deep fakes, and tapes that were exposed in this country yesterday. If you want our friendship to continue after May 15th, do not touch the Turkish state. We will always defend cooperation and friendship, though, he adds at the end to temper that. He doubled down in an interview with the Reuters news agency this Friday, saying, yeah, Russia's interfering.
He did, but he didn't actually bring to the table much hard evidence, and that I think that's the problem. I think everybody was expecting that Russia would kind of interfere with this election. There's a lot riding on it for Russia. They very much want Erdogan to stay in power. It's a somewhat ally of theirs, although Turkey is in NATO. It's kind of treaded this very ambiguous line with Russia throughout the war. If Erdogan loses this election, Moscow in a way has to kind of reconfigure its alliance completely. And it's uncertain where that's going to leave it.
Of course, for the time being, we've heard statements from Kilicdaroglu saying he'll keep the channels open with Moscow. Now, on the campaign trail this Friday, Erdogan also accusing foreign powers of scuttling the candidacy of that third-party candidate, Muharrem Ince. But it doesn't sound like he's referring to Russia. Instead, the president speaks of powers that also use the same Gulenists who tried to topple him in the failed 2016 coup.
Mr. Kemal used that power as a toy and hatched a plot against Ince via FETÖ. It is the same that power also insults Turkey's national interests on foreign social media platforms. Kilicdaroglu dragged all institutions and parties to bankruptcy under his authorization before he is directed from outside as a toy.
Dave Clark, your reaction listening to all of that?
Well, I think everybody involved in the Turkish election likes to blame things on foreign powers. It's difficult to see what the foreign powers that Erdogan has in mind would have to gain from interfering at this stage, because without knowing exactly who's going to win, we don't know who we have to be friends with afterwards. I think here in Brussels, people are watching it very closely, but it's not exactly as clear-cut a decision they have to make as to who to support as you might imagine. Obviously, there's been a lot of bad blood between Erdogan and various European leaders and the European Union itself over the years, but Europe has been quietly reassured that they haven't had to advance on Turkey's European membership application for decades now, because it's easy to say no to Erdogan, but if Kilicdaroglu arrives with a nominally more pro-European power, it's going to be harder to tell him no when he attempts to move towards closer ties.
Noor Ibrahim, your thoughts on the stakes of this election, particularly, is it again about whether Turkey turns more towards Europe, stays in this sort of pivot role between Russia, the EU, and the Middle East?
Absolutely. I think this is an unprecedented situation for Erdogan. I think that there's just so much at stake, and obviously the earthquake played a huge role. But I think besides that, so many Turkish people, particularly the younger population, are just kind of sick and tired of his strongman tendencies, of his crackdowns on dissent. I think there is a desire for this rehabilitation of Turkey's image around the world to more reflect that population and the openness that they want their country to move in that direction. I think that he has every reason to be worried, and of course that's exactly what's at stake. I think we had an article in the Daily Beast once from Craig Capadas where he spoke to many sources that were quite close to NATO officials who described Turkey under Erdogan as the most cursed NATO member. So I think the outcome of this election will absolutely play, a massive role in rehabilitating that image, but also translating it into actual policy and closeness with other member allies in NATO and the EU.
Yeah,
there's just so much at stake here.
You point to how the youth will vote, 5 million first-time voters in this election. How will earthquake victims vote if they're able to vote? All parties working furiously to try to bus citizens to their polling stations, even if they've been displaced to other neighborhoods or even other cities. In quake-devastated places like Antakya, there's a fair amount of confusion.
The closest polling station is 5 minutes away, but they're sending me to a school that's an hour away on foot. I have no car, I'm in financial distress and we cannot work. We will gladly vote with God's permission and we hope for the best. My whole family, all our relatives will vote.
So plenty of unknowns heading towards election day.
Absolutely, and this election is really overshadowed by the earthquake, which was just a couple of months ago. You had more than 50,000 people died and untold numbers left homeless. And it really kind of exposed Erdogan's, the corruption of the entire system. You had buildings where the regulations being completely ignored and, people who were in favor with the government were allowed to do whatever they wanted. And then after the earthquake, the tremendous failings of the rescue and relief operations. And it really kind of showed a kind of hollowing out of government institutions under Erdogan. It's become increasingly a kind of ideological power. But does that mean that earthquake victims will go against him? Not necessarily.
Yeah, another one of those unknowns. Now, across the Black Sea, they're bracing for battle, that counter-offensive in Ukraine. And it's been a startling week of competing narratives. With so much of Russia's military at the front, Red Square Tuesday saw a scaled-down May 9th Victory Day parade, although Vladimir Putin did manage to convince leaders of 7 former states. There you see Armenia's Nikol Pashinyan to drop in. Some, like Pashinyan, Vladislav Davidson, who've been trying to keep their distance from Vladimir Putin.
Yeah. Last year, if I remember correctly, it was only 2. I think it was just Lukashenko and Putin. I think maybe it was the Kazakh leader also. But certainly he's up 4 or 5 leaders since last year. There were almost no tanks on the front. The Ukrainians were on the Red Square front, on that front, because they were all on the other front, and the Ukrainians having kind of made discreet warnings that they could make problems during the parade. The Russians had just one single T-34 from...
You think it was Ukrainians who sent those drones last week over the Kremlin? Because it could be Russian dissidents, it could be anything.
It could be Belarus dissidents, it could be internal Russian dissidents. I certainly don't think... I'm not one of these people who thinks it's a false flag operation. It's an embarrassing thing for the Kremlin. If they can fly a drone into the Kremlin, that means the Russian air defenses don't mean anything. So I hope it was the Ukrainians, but who knows?
All right, and the usual talking points, Vladimir Putin talking about a war being waged against Russia, still calling it a special military operation, though, when it comes to Ukraine itself. May the 9th in Moscow, May the 9th in Kyiv, where the president of the EU Commission came to celebrate Europe Day alongside the president of candidate state Ukraine. Dave Clark, you were there. What was the mood like?
The mood, I was surprised by Zelensky's demeanor. He was grim, but I suppose he's often grim now. The war's been dragging on for a year, and the Ukrainians are worried that too much is hanging on this long anticipated offensive that they're supposed to launch in the east. They're worried that Western support will depend on them making spectacular breakthroughs when it's not far from clear whether they can quickly gain a lot of ground. They can maybe reverse the narrative a bit, but they are tending to manage expectations a little as regards the imminent military successes. You know, they've did very well towards the tail end of last year, October, November, when they evicted the Russians from Kharkiv and from Kherson. But now they'll be coming up against battle lines, some of which have been in place and barely moved since 2014. And you can just see in the Battle of Bakhmut, where the Russians have thrown thousands of troops and mercenaries into the fight and barely gained more than a few kilometers, although they have taken now majority of the city. And today we hear that they're being rolled back, by a few hundred yards here and there. There's a concern that the war will turn into a stalemate. So this week's meeting in Kiev was about the political messaging, about Ukraine's European future, about its future one day as a member of the European Union. And the European officials that I traveled with to Kiev are convinced that the Ukrainians are taking this extremely seriously, that they want to begin formal accession negotiations this year. And it will depend whether they can convince Ursula von der Leyen's European Commission to issue a positive report on that to the member states, some of which are more sceptical than others.
Yeah, there are others who've been waiting in line a while to join the EU. We'll see how that plays out. And as you were saying, as we wait for
I'm told it's not a queue, though. They can go past some of them.
I see. Well,
it's not a taxi rank. Ukraine can get ahead of others.
All right. We'll ask the Macedonians, for instance, how they feel about all that. As we wait for Ukraine's much vaunted counteroffensive, lots of focus on the flashpoint city of Bakhmut, which has been likened to the World War I Battle of Verdun. The leader of the Wagner paramilitaries has certainly stepped out of the shadows with this fight. Hardly a day goes by without Yevgeny Prigozhin issuing an outburst against the West, but also the Russian Defense Ministry and the regular army.
И вместо того, чтобы потратить снаряд, убить противника, сохранить жизнь нашего солдата, убивают наших солдат, а счастливый дедушка думает, что ему хорошо. И что делать дальше стране, если он окажется прав, дай Бог всем здоровья. А вот что делать стране, что делать нашим детям, внукам, будущему России, и как выиграть войну, если вдруг случайно, я просто предполагаю, окажется, что этот дедушка законченный мудак.
Happy grandfather, an effing moron. There's lots of bad language here. Who's happy grandfather?
Vladimir Putin, clearly.
Do you think it's Vladimir Putin?
I would think so, yes.
I actually am on the fence. I think he actually means Gerasimov and Shoigu, but he is saying...
The head of the military and the defense minister.
I think he's saying it in such a discreet way that different people can read different people into the role of a happy grandfather. I think that's ambiguous for a reason.
Noor Ibrahim, your thoughts on this?
I agree completely. I think it's ambiguous for a reason, and I think everything that he says is quite calculated, and it's meant to draw attention, it's meant to create some controversy, and this is just developing into a huge problem for the Kremlin, because it's not just, these random outbursts or videos that he's putting out, but every time, the Kremlin comes with reports a major battlefield update, like today, there's talk of Russian forces retreating from certain positions in Bakhmut, and the Kremlin framed that as, okay, we're just regrouping. We're regrouping and measuring things. And almost immediately, Prigozhin went out and said, this is no regrouping. This is flight, where they're just fleeing. So it's gotten to the point where he's almost live fact-checking like the official Russian report, and that's just an incredible position to be in, and quite embarrassing for Russia, because this is someone who makes headlines around the world. He's a prominent figure. People are listening to what he's saying, and beyond that, there's a lot of Russians inside Russia that are quite big fans of Prigozhin as well. So it's really fascinating to watch this dynamic play out, and the tension, and just no holes barred at this point, in terms of the clashes between Moscow and the shadow army.
Dave Clark, is this vying for some more power, or is this simply trying to get the boss's attention?
Well, I would have disagreed with Noor a few weeks ago. My initial take on the counter narrative from Prigozhin was that Putin would be fairly comfortable to see all of his various lieutenants, shadow or otherwise, fighting in public, because he's ultimately the audience for that, and he gets to decide it. But as Noor says, that it's got to a fairly extreme point now where it may be doing Prigozhin more harm than good in the boss's eyes. And it seems to be that he wanted to claim the victory in Bakhmut. And that he blames the defense ministry for not supplying him enough ammunition to get that. But it's not clear whether the Russian military has enough munitions in that area anyway. They've been firing a lot, and they've also been suffering quite a lot of losses in terms of ammunition dumps and supply chain. So at this stage, it does seem to be a problem for the Kremlin.
Yeah, the mercenaries of Wagner, who are not so formidable, it seems, on the battlefield, but their name has come up in conversation elsewhere. This Friday, the United Nations Human Rights Commission laying blame at the door of Mali's junta for the March 2022 massacre of some 500 civilians in central Mali, Malian soldiers, but not only.
Our report concluded that there are strong indications that more than 500 people were killed. The vast majority executed by Malian troops and foreign military personnel during a 5-day military operation in March 2022.
The UN report does not specify nationalities, but these armed white men, everybody believes those are Russians.
Correct. And there has been a lot of reporting in the last 6 months or so, perhaps the last year, about the Wagner Group's, the Wagner mercenaries' involvement in Africa, not only in Mali. This is actually an incredibly worrying thing, because you have all these local wars that have been going on for almost as long as the Ukraine conflict has been going on. And that in some ways are almost impossible to kind of overcome in some regular international peace treaty or peace mission, unless one can actually understand who's involved.
Now, the original remit of Wagner is to go to places where there's gold, where there's diamonds, and act as a little bit of a cash cow for the Kremlin.
Sure.
Can Yevgeny Prigozhin, if he's overstretched, go back to his former post now?
So that's the thing. A lot of my friends and colleagues in my line of work in the Russia-Ukraine hand game, we all think that he burned through a lot of his troops, and he basically doesn't have the cadres left in order to continue dominating these little African countries, these poor little African countries where there shouldn't be Russians, and that he doesn't have the manpower in order to continue making money. So he's thinking, well, I have to get out of here with some of my cadres intact, and if I don't pull out of Bakhmut now, I'll have nobody to send to Syria or nobody to send to Sudan or wherever, right? And it's a big problem for him. He's burned through all the conscripts that they sent his way and all the guys that they took out of the prisons. He does have a core of very professional former Russian army mercenaries who are very good at what they do, which is killing. But there's not that many of them, and they had to sacrifice a lot of them against entrenched Ukrainian artillery positions. So if the numbers that we're hearing from Western intelligence and Ukrainian intelligence are correct, I mean, how many guys could he have left?
Well, the spillover from Russia's war in Ukraine is certainly being felt a hemisphere away. On Thursday, the U.S. ambassador to South Africa said he was confident that a Russian ship uploaded weapons from the Simonstown naval base back in December. That sparked a denial from the president and his government. Still, though, Cyril Ramaphosa ordering an inquiry, and the State Department in Washington standing by the story of its man in Pretoria.
The U.S. has serious concerns about the docking of a sanctioned Russian cargo vessel at a South African naval port in December of last year. And as good partners do, we have raised those concerns directly with multiple South African officials.
Vivian Waltz, lots of denials. Does the story seem plausible, though?
Yes, absolutely. My gut instinct tells me it's correct. South Africa has a lot of allegiance and a lot of ties to Russia, which it doesn't see the motivation to abandon at this point because of the Ukraine war. There is the kind of grouping of the so-called BRICS grouping, which includes, China, Russia, India, and South Africa, where people have a lot of, not exactly sympathy, but they see in Russia a kind of alternative path from, U.S. superpower. There's visa-free travel, for example, between the two countries. So there's a lot of, friendship that is good. That's
How do ordinary South Africans feel about it, though? Do they?
I think many of them quite like Russia. There's also a lot of historic links.
Because they supported the ANC.
Absolutely, yeah. You have, Russia as your old kind of liberation ally, and that has really continued one or two generations later.
Dave Clark, it's the second time we've had a May 9th now since the all-out invasion by Vladimir Putin. A year ago, we were predicting that non-aligned countries like South Africa would have to eventually pick their side in this battle. And yet, here we are a year later, still wondering whether the allies or partners are ready to go all in for one side or the other.
Well, yes, and that's further complicated by the other elephant in the room, which is China. Obviously, a lot of the non-aligned powers, a lot of the southern powers, South Africa, as Vivian just mentioned, had closer, warmer relations with Russia than Western powers did. And I think there was a naive assumption among many people here in Europe and perhaps in Washington as well at the start of this conflict that Russia's aggression and a flagrant breach of Ukraine's sovereignty would lead the rest of the world to fall in behind the campaign against him. But it's not seen like that in many other capitals. I note today that whereas South Africa has denied the weapons shipment story, the Kremlin has announced that Ramaphosa and Putin have agreed to further intensify mutually beneficial ties in various fields. And in asking the rest of the world just to fall in behind West's support for Ukraine, we're also forgetting that they'll be looking to see which way China goes on this, which way India goes on this. And in terms of their economies, their ties are not just with the West.
Noor Ibrahim, it's about being able to sit the fence until there's another election in a year and a half's time where you are?
Sorry, Francois, I didn't quite catch that.
Is it about waiting a year and a half until there's another election in the hopes for those who support Russia that Donald Trump will be the victor?
I mean, there's absolutely a real fear of that. And look, the South Africa thing is a great example. Some countries are still dealing with Russia openly, shamelessly, not paying any attention to what's happening in Ukraine and, the alleged war crimes and all of that. But at the same time, a country like South Africa or other places could also just be working in the shadows and doing, underhanded dealings without publicizing them. And I'm sure that's happened with other parties, not just South Africa. So I think that there is a real chance that, the fatigue of war, the headlines dying down, that's a very real fear. And it's important to also note that what a country does say, or what a president or government official does say publicly isn't exactly how it's going to play out. Even when it comes to something like Putin's arrest warrant under the ICC. I mean, there was a big report that came out in a major South African newspaper that behind the scenes, government officials were trying to, quietly beg Putin not to come because they didn't want to, even risk having to be obliged to arrest him if he steps foot in the country. So I think that's just really important context to keep in mind.
Yeah, things won't necessarily play out the way they do. They're expected. Tense relations could take a turn for the much worse or for the better. It's difficult to, at this point, get perspective on why Iran, and this is breaking news, has decided to release 2 French citizens. Paris contends that there are 5 others being held in what it's referred to in the past as hostage diplomacy. France 24's Andrew Hillier is at the Le Bourget airport north of the capital. Those 2 French nationals released by Tehran.
Yeah, that's right, Francois. We are at Le Bourget Airport, just north of the French capital. Benjamin Brière and Bernard Fellon touching down in the last few minutes. We saw the plane touch down just behind us. We already got reaction from French President Emmanuel Macron early in the day, tweeting that both men can finally reunite with their loved ones. He said it was a relief. Iran calling those releases a humanitarian act in line with relevant laws and regulations. Now, just to give you a bit more context about these 2 men, Fellon, who is a dual French-Irish national, detained in March. He was detained on the pretext of providing information to another country. You have to obviously bear in mind that his detention happening amidst those ongoing anti-government demonstrations in Iran. And then Benjamin Brière, he'd been detained since May 2020, so he spent 3 years behind bars. He had been accused by Iran of flying a remote-controlled mini helicopter to obtain images near Iran's border with Turkmenistan. Of course, both men had been going on hunger strike in protest, so lots of concerns about their health conditions from their families. But at the end of what has been obviously quite a difficult ordeal for both men this evening at Le Bourget.
All right, we'll see whether what it leads to, whether they're what is the counterpart of that. Many thanks, Andrew Hillier, for that live update. Now, we're wondering about counterparts and what are sweeteners for deals. We've seen how in the United States, there's been, Joe Biden putting forth a green America first, what with there's been his plan for big energy subsidies. Earlier, the French president traveling to Dunkirk in northern France, a Rust Belt city, for the launch of a giant battery factory with a Taiwanese group called Prologium, another by a Chinese maker, XTC. The same day, Sweden's Northvolt announcing its own gigafactory in northern Germany. Music to the ears of that country's car industry. Northvolt still contemplating another factory in North America. It'll be interesting to see what kind of sweeteners France and Germany bring to those two deals. Vivian Walt, this is a story I know you've been following closely. The head of that Taiwanese company, the French head, saying, yes, there were, I think the words he used were incentives, but he didn't want to go into specifics because it's got to pass muster with regulators.
Exactly. And I think this is the problem. And in fact, this week I was in Germany, and a couple of days ago was in the Bundestag talking to people about the Inflation Reduction Act in Washington and what needed to happen in Germany. So as with each...
So we're into a new era of protectionism?
Absolutely. But I think, and this is the message I heard in Berlin, is there's tremendous concern, obviously, about the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, which is $430 billion incentives, huge tax breaks for people setting up production in the U.S. of things like batteries, all sorts of green tech. And in fact, Northvolt, as you mentioned, is, I thought, more than just contemplating, but actually is planning a big production plant somewhere in the U.S., as is, a number of other people who were going to set up in the EU and now have decided to relocate a lot of the production, including Tesla, for example, which obviously has poured billions into Germany.
It's got a big gigafactory just outside of Berlin.
Enormous gigafactory, vast, and was going to have a vast battery factory, and is now going to relocate much of that production to the US. So the message I got in Berlin was, we can offer all the sweeteners, we can, afford to give, but it has to happen on the EU level.
All right, and when it comes to Brussels, by the way, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, raising the hackles of environmentalists. On Thursday, he told an audience of business leaders, enough with this pesky red tape.
I'm calling for a pause in European regulations. Now is the time to implement rules. We shouldn't make new changes because we'll lose all the actors. We need stability. Right now, we need to speed up deployment because otherwise, the risk in the end is to be the best in terms of regulation and the worst said in terms of financing.
No time for environmental regulation, Dave Clark.
Well, just as Vivian was saying that the Americans had underestimated the fury in Europe about the Inflation Reduction Act, I think Emmanuel Macron might have underestimated how he would ruffle feathers here in Brussels with that comment. They've attempted to row it back slightly since, insisting that the existing Green Deal policies can obviously still go ahead and pass. And Emmanuel Macron's party in the European Parliament here largely still supports them. But it was seen as a rare Eurosceptic, shall we say, moment from the most famously pro-European president they've had in France for a while. I know the Elysée was annoyed that so much attention was paid to that particular part of his speech, because broadly, France wants an industrial policy. That's not a scoop, but Joe Biden has given them the best alibi ever, and as Vivian says, many other people in Europe are now falling in behind this idea that we have to compete with U.S. subsidies and China's low costs.
Well, okay, before we go, by the way,
reindustrialize the continent.
Before we go, and it's that time of the year when a whole continent, this one, indulges in a special kind of guilty pleasure. Eurovision Song Contest weekend. Dateline Liverpool by the banks of the Mersey, the home of the Beatles, decked out in a lot of blue and yellow, by the way. That's because last year's winner, Ukraine, is not in a position to be hosting song contests. The Eurovision Song Contest didn't used to be so political, but in times of war, First off, Noor Ibrahim, how much attention is paid to the Eurovision Song Contest where you are? Have you ever set eyes on this spectacle?
I haven't. I've watched a few clips here and there, but my guess would be most people here are not very plugged in. But I don't want to speak for everyone. That's just the people that I know. But I'm definitely open to it. I think yeah.
You're open to it, okay. How about you, Vladislav Davidson?
Well, I live in Europe, but I have a reputation as a snob to keep up, so like I won't admit to watching it, but of course I have, and I always cheer for my team, which is the Ukrainians. But this year the Moldovans, who are of course also in the middle of problems with Russia, and Russia's trying to get coup d'etats going in Moldova, so I cheer for them also because I'm also from Odessa and they're 70 kilometers away.
Does any of this have to do with music?
I know I don't care about any of it. I only care about to the extent that I care about like a football team or preparation, other kinds of preparation for war. But the clip of the Moldovans with their pagan ensembles, I like the pagan aspect of the Moldovan team this year. But again, I use the word team admittedly. I couldn't care less about the music, only about the politics and the war.
Whereas the Clark household will be fully embedded for all of Saturday night, correct?
Saturday night, yes. Sunday night will be at Union Saint-Gilloise to cheer on a different yellow and blue team in this weekend's Belgian Premier League playoffs. But this idea that it's a song contest and not political. Yes, sure. Cyprus always thinks that Greece has the best song. Greece always thinks that Cyprus has the best song. Purely because of their shared disco culture.
Vivian Walt.
And I'll also be cheering on Moldova because I'll be in Chisinau at the end of the month for the European Political Community Summit, and I'd like them to be in party mood when I'm there.
Vivian Walt, your thoughts on the fact that, because last year there was a sort of unease. They kicked out Russia from the Eurovision Song Contest.
Good.
Is it? Yes, and some made the argument, just like they do when Wimbledon comes around, that you shouldn't penalize athletes or musicians.
Yes, and by the way, this is also about money, as everything is. But this is also about participants paying millions of euros.
We're talking high art here, not money, Vivian.
Pardon me. I think the Eurovision Song Contest should go global. I think every country in the world should create some happy, dancey song and, have a blowout party. I think the world needs it.
Noor Ibrahim, by the way, it's even seeped its way, you could say, onto the campaign trail in Turkey. Kemal Kilicdaroglu has says he'll bring Turkey back into the Eurovision Song Contest. Recep Tayep Erdogan felt it was not of a high moral standing.
Yeah, I think everyone deserves a shot. I think all of Turkey maybe shouldn't be punished from this great pleasure that is Eurovision for one person who might not be around for too much long after. So I get that.
All right. The Eurovision Song Contest, which may or may not provide a respite from grimmer topics in these grim times. Noor Ibrahim, I want to thank you so much for joining us from New York City. Dave Clark in Brussels. Vivian Walt, Vladislav Davidson, thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.